So this one can be, can be a bit confusing. I was confused actually at first when I started looking into it, but I think the first step to figure out your validation requirements is to understand if you're a merchant or a service provider according to PCI. Merchant is a lot easier to understand. It's just a business that accepts credit card transactions for services they're providing or goods they're selling. So if you are a merchant and you accept credit cards from the major payment brands, then you'll have to be PCI compliant. A service provider is a company that doesn't necessarily accept credit card transactions for payment of goods or services, but they can impact the security of the cardholder data environment of a merchant or of a payment brand, specifically. So service providers, for example, an example of a service provider could be a managed service provider, right? They're not necessarily accepting your credit cards, right, for you, but they might have access to the environment where you store credit card transactions, or they have access to the cardholder data environment where credit card data is stored. And because that managed service provider can access that environment, the merchant would have to make sure that that managed service provider is PCI compliant, right? Because they're a vendor, they can impact their cardholder data environment. If there's a breach at the managed service provider, then they might get into the credit card data stored by the merchant, right? So that's kind of the idea of a service provider. If you are a merchant, the first place you're going to want to look is to the payment brands, right? So the payment brands actually decide what the validation requirements are. So for example, if you're a merchant and you're accepting over 6 million Visa transactions a year, then you're going to be considered a level 1 merchant for Visa. Now, if you go to Visa's website, they're going to say, okay, if you're a level 1 merchant and you accept 6 million transactions a year, here are your validation requirements. If you accept less than 6 million, here are your validation requirements, right? As part of those level 1 requirements, if you are accepting over 6 million, you might need to engage a PCI qualified security assessor to perform an audit. So, in summary, for a merchant, the first place you want to go to is the payment brands, because they decide what your validation requirements are. Visa might have different requirements than MasterCard. MasterCard might have different requirements than American Express. So that's the first place you want to go. In the service provider example that I kind of gave, the payment brands aren't going to decide that. Your customers are going to decide what your validation requirements are. So in that MSP example, if the merchant decides that, hey, this MSP is high risk, we want to make sure they really are truly PCI compliant, they're going to put in a contract that you need to engage a qualified security assessor to perform a PCI audit. However, they could also say, we just need you to fill out a self-assessment questionnaire and send that to us. So for service providers, it's not as clear cut. You really have to look at the contract language that you have with your customers. But so it could vary for service providers. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but the idea is that merchants go to your payment brand websites to find out your validation requirements, and service providers talk to your customers and see what they require from a PCI compliance perspective.